Greetings to thee, brothers and sisters, in the name of Christ and the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. This is surely one of the most gruesome tales in the gospel. There's no dodging the bullet. There's no dodging the bullet. This is surely one of the most bloodthirsty people that we read about in the gospel. And when I say most bloodthirsty people, it's difficult to figure out who's worse, Herod or Herodias in this story. At a minimum, we can take away from this story in terms of the lesson that the Episcopal Church has in putting this into the lectionary and trying to figure out what it means for us today in 2015. At a minimum, we now know where the cliche comes from. Somebody's head was on a platter, right? That's the first thing. The second, though, is in trying to figure out what it is that we are to take from this story in terms of how it relates to Jesus and his ministry. Notice that this story occurs early on in the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest gospel. What do we take from this story and this tale of Herod and his evil ways? Because notice, Sue, as she was reading the gospel, didn't make an error. It's written that way, that Philip was married to his brother's sister. Philip was married to his brother's sister. No, sorry, to his brother's wife. It's complicated even to retell, isn't it? So yes, that gospel lesson means what it says. This woman was married to two men, and the two men were brothers. How on earth did they come up with that arrangement? Who knows? Back in the ancient times, marriages were much more political than they were about romance. And Herod that we read about in this story is not the same Herod that we read about at the time of Christmas, when that Herod the Great, the great builder of ancient Israel, had the innocents slaughtered because of his paranoid concern about Jesus' birth and eventually taking over the kingdom. This Herod that we talk about in this gospel lesson today is Herod Antipas, one of the three sons of Herod the Great: Herod Antipas, Philip, and Archelaus. These three were rulers of Israel after Herod the Great died. Rome just kind of divided up Israel and said, the three of y'all run it together. So who knows how Herod's wife and Philip's wife became the same person? What we do know is that Herod had a soft spot in his heart for Herodias. Herod had a soft spot in his heart for Herodias. And so it would be wonderful to take away from this gospel lesson today a message about fatherly love. But when the fatherly love is expressed in such a gruesome, violent manner, I think we have to put that aside and simply say there were some really awful things going on in the court of Herod Antipas at this time. In fact, I listened again in the gospel reading this morning to hear what exactly was it that made Herod so concerned about John in the first place. Why was John in prison in Herod's castle in the first place? And it's because John was going around to his disciples and to anyone who would listen in Israel, preaching against Herod for being married to his brother's wife. It was exactly the same situation that got him in prison in the first place that made Herod so ready to accept Herodias' wish. And in the end, when Herodias said, "I want John's head on a platter," Herod was grieved. What do we make of that for this person who expresses and acts in such an evil manner? How do we interpret this phrase in the gospel that says Herod was grieved after all of this? I think you could say, well, maybe he had an act of conscience at the last minute and yet still went forward with his evil act of slaying John. Or he was grieved because he knew of the political implications, that John was well loved by his disciples, his followers all throughout Israel. Or maybe it's because he knew deep down that John was the precursor to Jesus. That John was the forerunner, the voice in the wilderness, telling folks, prepare the way of the Lord. I am not worthy to untie his sandal strings, but there is one greater than me that follows. Maybe Herodias knew that, or Herod knew that deep down, and that's why he was grieved. We'll never know. But it is interesting as we take a look at this story and look at all the nuances, all the politics, all the romance, and all the evil, that in the end, there was an act of love. John's body lay in the prison, and who came to get it? His disciples. His disciples came to get it, to give him a good burial. John then becomes a symbol not only of righteousness and lawfulness, but of mercy and charity, for his disciples came to give him. Now, part of the message here is that in this gospel lesson is the fragility of life. John is preaching all throughout Israel. He's got a great ministry growing and developing. He's excited about the one who comes after him. And he's going around all over Israel telling folks, this is it. Here comes the Messiah. And yet his life is snuffed out like that, literally on the whim of a girl. And so it's an important time, I think, not only to reflect on the fragility of life, but what we can do as good Christians and members of the church to help prepare our lives, our families, and our matters, our affairs, for that fragility of life. Last week, one of the parishioners asked me for the name of a lawyer who could help them prepare a will. And during the week that has just followed, I've seen in two separate national publications, one Kiplinger's, a business magazine, and the other USA Today, the daily newspaper for our country, two different articles on why it's important to have a will. So I thought I would mention that, some nugget of education and understanding that we could take from this otherwise horrible story in the Gospels. You know, one of the articles I read in Kiplinger said that 75% of Americans don't have wills. I was really surprised by that, given how much you hear about them, given how much people talk about being either left in a will or cut out of a will. That's part of our popular culture. And from my perspective, as part of my other profession, how many lawyers I know who do wills, trusts, and estates. So I was surprised to read that. But as part of my training in seminary and just recognizing the job that parish priests have, this is commonplace in our church for priests to be asked on at least an annual basis to preach to their parishes about the benefits of having a will. Isn't that something? I have never heard anybody at any of my churches preach on the benefits of having a will. So if you haven't heard this either, then welcome to the party. There are three things then that I'll leave you with as we talk about the benefits of the will, everybody. The first is that most of all, it gives you peace of mind in preparing your affairs. It puts you in some measure of control about an issue that very few people have control about. Right? When you go to the great beyond and join God and his Son in heaven. When does that happen? Only God knows. But putting your affairs in order in advance gives you some peace of mind and ability to help guide folks after your body has gone cold. The second is that it helps your family. This is not an area of law that I practice in, but I've heard plenty of tales, both in church and in my profession, of families that fight like cats and dogs after a relative is passed on because the relative left no guidance as to how their affairs were to be handled afterwards. Starting the minute that person passes away and figuring out, well, what do we do with our loved one? Did they want to be buried? Did they want to be cremated? If they wanted to be buried, where were they going to be buried? And so on, and so on, and so on. And unfortunately, the lack of guidance from the person who's deceased often leads the family to make some really poor decisions that I've seen time and time again folks in the industry of burial take advantage of. And so it's best if you can address all of those things in advance by directing folks, here's how to act when I have passed on to heaven. The third benefit, of course, is that you get to direct, if you have any financial benefit to do so, you get to direct where your finances are going to go. Now, of course, one of the reasons the Episcopal Church wants parish priests to talk about this is we've got to put in a good word for the church. But here at St. Gabriel's, that's particularly acute. You know, Sandy is our finance chair, and he and I talk on a regular basis about the financial state of affairs at St. Gabriel's. Any amount would benefit the parish. Any amount that you leave in your will ultimately help carry on God's mission in Oakwood through this parish and help all of the folks here that you know and love with the financial matters of the church. So if you were to do a will,